Welcome to children and seniors. First up, we have 4 sets of minutes that need to be approved. You've received those via email. Are there any additions or corrections to any of those? January 12th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. I've read them and they seem very thorough to me. Representative Johnson moved to accept the minutes, second by Representative Mosier. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Thank you. The minutes are passed. Are there requests for bill introductions? Okay, seeing none, we'll get right into our agenda for today. We're going to talk about early childhood trauma, and we'll start off with Dr. Dina Hubbard. Hi, welcome to the committee.
And I'm here today on behalf of the Kansas chapter of the AAP. Okay, so we know that the relationship between a parent or caregiver and a child is so core to everything. And just think of a newborn baby. They rely on that parent or caregiver to respond to that cry. It says either I've got a dirty diaper, or I'm hungry, or I'm tired. That's what we assume happens. That doesn't happen for every child. And so imagine that same baby, if repeatedly they are not getting that nurturing and that response, that caregiving, their brain actually starts to undergo changes. They rewire because they're not getting that response. And so this just shows that secure relationship with a safe, stable, nurturing adult is really the protection for them. And that's how they build resilience. That's why some adversities trigger toxic stress, and we're going to talk about what that means, and also where recovery must occur. So we have to keep that kind of as the primary focus. But that relationship is very protective in helping them navigate the world ahead. So not all traumatic events are experienced the same. So why is it that 2 people can have the same experience, but for one it's very traumatic and devastating, and another it's not? Well, we know there are positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. So positive stress, first day of kindergarten, dropping your kid off at daycare for the first time, those are things that, they're stressful in the moment, but then you come down to baseline. Tolerable and toxic stress events, they can be the same events, but they're experienced differently. So that could be the death of a parent, childhood abuse, a natural disaster. Those can all cause high stress response system reactions. The difference is, are they buffered by those positive supports of that nurturing caregiver and the family unit and the community around them? So for a person experiencing stress without end, it just keeps happening, or without supports, they don't come back to baseline. They're at that high stress, kind of that fight, flight, freeze response all the time. And so think if you have a child that's in that situation, how challenging that must be to learn and develop and grow. So I would like to start by defining what I'm talking about by trauma, because often from a medical standpoint, when we're talking about trauma, we're thinking of a sports accident or motor vehicle accident. We're talking about psychological trauma. And so it's important to understand that each individual's perception of what is traumatic may be different, again, depending on their personal experiences, their resiliency, and that external supports that they have. So it's a very individualized experience. And it has to do, again, not just the individual, but the family and the community. So then we look at trauma in 3 different ways. So the event is the actual experience, or even the threat of a physical or psychological harm. That's one aspect. Or the event can be neglect, so the lack of or withholding or control of material or relations that are necessary for normal child health and development. It can be a single event, or it can be a repeated event. And that experience, again, is how that person assigns meaning to that event, and going forward, how that responds. The effects are the results of those persons' experiences of the event, and that's where we're going to talk about the ACEs study. So here again are just some potential traumatic events that we normally think of, and those that we often may not think of. So I wanted to include that for you. So the stress response system, I mentioned the fight, flight, or freeze. So when we're faced with a stressful situation, our minds and bodies are built to handle that. So imagine if you were in the jungle and there's a tiger chasing after you. Hopefully you'll go into the flight response, but those are your three options: fight, flight, or freeze. Anybody that's passed out at the sight of blood, which I used to do, believe it or not, that's the freeze part. So this is our body's way that it's built to respond to stress. So it's good that we have that. And so when we're faced with a stressful situation or a threat of it, those hormones in our body, those stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, are released to help us prepare. Now imagine if a child was at that level all the time, that fight, flight, freeze, all the time, never come back to baseline. And this can be due to either a long-lasting event, a really severe event, or a very frequent event. So there's not only the significant stressor, but also that lack of protective relationships. And so it's that imbalance that really causes the problem. We have learned, and this is not new literature, but I think it's just getting outside of the normal psychology and social work realm, is that the long-lasting implications of that early childhood trauma and lack of protective mechanisms leads to significant outcomes, and we'll talk about that for adult health. And so this can be impairments in physical, mental health. Again, the brain is an organ, like your pancreas is an organ, or your heart. And also just these biologic processes that are important for development, neurologic, epigenetic, meaning how your genes function going forward, and immunologic changes. So normally, when you're really stressed, sometimes that's the time when you get a virus or something, because that's part of what goes along with that. So here's just a graphic of the stress response system to kind of show that fight, flight, or freeze, and it really makes sense. But the body's just out of whack, and so the body is trying to do what it needs to do, and things become less controlled, again, because you're trying to escape harm. So extra oxygen goes to the brain, so that increases your alertness. So your vision, your hearing, those things are really more focused. Heart rate increases, blood pressure increases. You send less blood flow to your gut and your kidneys, because it's like, you can wait for blood flow, I gotta take care of these core organs. Blood rushes to the muscles so that you can run away from that tiger, and then the body sweats to release that extra heat. So again, our bodies are conditioned to act rather than think when there's a threat of danger. So again, think of if you were at this level all the time, how would you learn? How would you grow? How would you develop healthy mechanisms? So the next thing I would like to do, I don't know if anyone's seen this exercise, but it's the brain in the palm of your hand. So if you want to do this along with me, I will show you. But really, if you raise your hand, the palm and the wrist, that's your brainstem. That's all the stuff you don't have to think about. We don't have to think about breathing, our heart rate, controlling that, digestion, blood pressure. So that's your palm and your wrist. Now put your thumb in. This is your emotional brain. This represents the amygdala, the part of your brain that when there's a threat, there's a fight, flight, or freeze. And this can trigger even memories of threats. And so something that you see or hear may trigger that. And so that's your amygdala. Now put your fingers over that thumb. This is your prefrontal cortex. This is your rational thinking brain. Now, what happens if you're under stress all the time and you're in this fight or flight, and this thumb, your amygdala, is wiggling around? You're going to flip your lid, right? I think we've all had those moments, especially recently, right? So that is when your amygdala is so stressed and you're in that fight, flight, or freeze that you can't think rationally. You don't do rational things because you are in a survival mode. So I think that's a really great way to think about that. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm not going to go through this slide, but the things I wanted to point out is that trauma and this excessive fight, flight, and freeze response causes changes in the brain, the way the brain is wired. I mentioned the epigenetic changes, which lead to adult stress and reactivity behaviors and the immune function. So we've actually been able to see changes in the brain that happen when there is excessive stress. So this can happen during the developmental phases of a child as well as into the adult years. So the important thing is that trauma physically alters the brain. So the things they notice, the prefrontal cortex, remember those were your fingers here, that's the rational thinking part of your brain. Excuse me, that is smaller. That is smaller in kids that have had trauma in their early formative years. So that can lead to decreased academic achievements, decreased IQ scores, difficulty with attention. And again, if you've been under this stress and you never come back down to baseline, that makes a lot of sense. Also, the hippocampus is smaller, and this area is really important for storing and retrieving memories. And so it distinguishes between past and present. So you can imagine that if you're at this stress stage all of the time and your hippocampus is smaller, you're not going to be able to perceive as well between what has happened and what's happening right now. That can lead to extremist thinking, aggression, impulsivity. Think about a lot of kids that are in the juvenile justice system. It's probably something that's happened to them that's made that. And then that overactive amygdala, that thumb, hypersensitive, decreased emotional intelligence, and high-risk behaviors can result from that. So here's a picture. Let me see. On the right here, this is an orphan, actually a severely neglected child, and on the left is a healthy brain. And so you will see that this is a PET scan of a healthy brain showing high activity, so that's the red, and low activity, which is the blue and the black. So at birth, only the primitive structures, such as the brain stem, remember the palm here, I'm sorry, not the palm, the wrist, those are fully functional. But then the rest of the brain is wiring. So you can see on the brain on the right in a child that's been abused and neglected that they don't have a lot of red areas where there's high activity. They have a lot of black and blue, and then the temporal areas, this is really significant, is that that's where a lot of how the brain, how to respond to stress and things happen in the temporal lobes, and you can see they're practically gone. So there are physical changes in the brain that result from trauma. I've mentioned this already, but just that learning, if you've got those stress hormones all the time, then it's going to be difficult to learn and grow. So the ACEs study is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was actually done in 1998 in Kaiser Permanente in California, and they looked at 17,000 individuals, and these were educated, middle-class individuals, and they looked at, in the first 18 years of their life, how many of these things did they experience. So they broke it up into 3 different categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And each one of these is a point. So you can even in your mind think, as I talk through these, how many of these did you have? What would your ACE score be in the first 18 years of life? So abuse, you'd get a point for physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. If there was neglect, either physical or emotional, each one of those is a point. And then household dysfunction, was there a member of the family that had severe mental illness? That was there domestic violence in the household? Was there divorce? Who would think that divorce would affect your risk for heart disease later in life? Was there a family member that was incarcerated, or was there substance use? So that you can have a score up to 10. So that's what I want you to remember as we go forward. But these were the traditional factors that they looked at. Subsequent studies have included witnessing violence, discrimination, neighborhoods that are not safe, being bullied, or living in foster care, also as potential points. So what they found was that the prevalence of these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, was much more common than they thought. And in fact, people with 6 or more ACEs died nearly 20 years earlier on average than those without ACEs. 2/3 of adults have at least one ACE, and again, it's all socioeconomic levels. 1 in 8 adults has greater than 4 ACEs. So of all those horrible things that I mentioned, 1 in 8 individuals has at least 4 of those, and that dramatically increases your risk for poor health outcomes, I'm sorry. And it's a dose-response relationship. And here you can see that for specific diseases, so if you have an ACE score greater than or equal to 4, compared to someone who has none, your risk for diabetes and cancer almost 1.5 to 2 times greater. Heart disease, stroke, 2 to 2.5 times greater. COPD, lung disease, 4 times greater. Clinical depression, 4.6, 4.7 for that in illicit drugs. And get this, 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. So what happens early on in children affects their adult health outcomes. So if we can do something to help, and we'll talk about there is resilience, if we can address that early on, what a great return on investment. So findings in children and families today, just to give you an idea, children with greater than or equal to 4 ACEs are 32 times more likely to have behavioral problems in school. So these are kids, they haven't got to that adult phase yet, but just the fact that they have those ACEs early in their life and right now, 32 times more likely to have behavioral problems. If they have at least 3 ACEs or more, they're 4 times more likely to have developmental delays. And just think about the added stress that that's already going to impact on the family. Greater than or equal to 4 ACEs, they are 6 times more likely to use alcohol by the age of 14. And those with greater than or equal to 4 are twice as likely to have a body mass index over the 85th percentile. Adolescents with greater than or equal to 7 ACEs are 51 more times likely to attempt suicide. Pretty astounding. So parent ACEs are bad for kids too, because, it's kind of the cycle continues. So how it does that, exposure to high-risk health behaviors, vulnerable living conditions, poor parent physical and mental health for themselves, and exposure to impaired or dysfunctional parenting. So this is what I really love about the Family First Act, was that it is all about healing with them together, because you can't just treat the child and not treat the parent and the home environment. Those who are very low income, unemployed, or low education are likely to have a higher ACEs as well. Here's a graphic that just shows you how individual experiences, so that's what's above the ground level there, those are, often we think of these and when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, but then if you look at the root underneath the ground level, these are community environments and how much they also contribute to this. So here's the good news that I'm going to leave you with. This is treatable. Post-traumatic stress doesn't have to become post-traumatic stress disorder. It does take a lot of work and investment, but it can be post-traumatic growth. And that's why 2 people can have the same experience, and one is devastated and will never be the same, and one can get back up again. So that post-traumatic growth is the goal. We can't ever take away the trauma. But the brain is very plastic, resilient. That's one of the things I love about kids, and especially the babies in the NICU. They can make new connections. So it's a high time for for opportunity for healing and growth. And then hopefully, even if they've had those ACEs and their parents have had those ACEs, if we can get them the help they need, they can learn to self-regulate their thoughts and emotional reactions. And so trauma-informed care is part of that. And again, this is very common in psychology and social work. It's getting into healthcare. I would love to see it get into the criminal justice system, into the legislative system, into our schools, which it is there as well. But instead of thinking, what's wrong with you, think what's happened to you. And so I'll leave you with a story of a mom that I was taking care of her premature baby. She's had 3 premature babies. She'd never carried beyond like 25 weeks gestation. And she was very disruptive, rude, used bad words, was not kind to the staff. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to set some boundaries. You can't talk to our staff like that. By the time that we were able to meet, the baby needed a reservoir because the baby's brain had lots of water on the brain, so we needed to do that procedure. And so when I sat down to set these boundaries, I thought I was doing such a good job. I said, do you know anybody that has a shunt in their brain? And she's like, oh yeah. My mom had a shunt because she was shot in the head when she was pregnant with me. And suddenly our conference went a little different direction. And I was humbled that here I was thinking that I'm a kind, non-judgmental person, and I had totally judged. She had a history of marijuana and alcohol use, lots of other issues, and so I had judged her. I had no idea what she had been through. Not only that, the father of this baby was different than her other children. Again, I had judged my bias. And it turns out the father of her other children was in jail for murdering another woman, and she felt bad that she hadn't put him in jail before he could do that to another woman. The father of this baby had been murdered, and she had 2 children that were she'd had one other child that was living that had been taken out of her custody and died in DFS custody, had been taken care of in the same hospital that we were. And so she didn't trust us. You know, that baby died. It was in somebody else's custody to protect the baby, and the baby died. And so she didn't have trust. She had had lots and lots of trauma. And I thought, you know what? I don't know how she does it. You know, and actually the fact that she was using marijuana and alcohol, I still don't know how she did it. And we all cope and use different things to get rid of pain. So thank you for your time today. I want to leave you with pediatrics is a 2-generation science, so we are looking at children and parents, and that relationship is so important. I would like to thank Patty Davis, who's a social worker who works on trauma-informed care, as well as Dr. Denise Dowd for sharing their slides and work on trauma-informed care in ACEs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard, and thanks for all that you do. I think we're going to hold questions to the end, and maybe some of the questions could be answered by the other presenters. So up next, we have David Jordan with United Methodist Health Ministries. Welcome to committee, David.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to members of the committee for having me. My name is David Jordan. I'm the president and CEO of the United Methodist Health Ministry Fund. We're a $70 million statewide health foundation that focuses on improving the health of Kansans. We focus on 3 areas: access to care, early childhood development, and healthy congregations. Recognizing that 80% of brain development happens before the age of 4, we see investing in early childhood as a central component of ensuring lifelong health, student success, and a way to make the most evidence-based interventions and investments in children and long-term economic security. We fund a variety of different programs in early childhood development and in this really 0 to 4 space. One of the programs that we've piloted throughout Kansas is called the Attachment Biobehavioral Catch-Up Program. And the purpose of this program is to mitigate the impacts of adversity, which Dr. Hubbard just laid out so poignantly. So much is packaged in how an individual and really a family, a parent and child dyad or a caregiver and child dyad, are able to navigate and deal with adversity, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma. For those families suffering from multiple ACEs, the Attachment Biobehavioral Catch-up Program, or ABC, has been shown nationally to be one of the most effective interventions. The benefits of this program are that it's 10 weeks long. It focuses on building attachment between caregiver and child by focusing on delight, nurturance, following the lead, and avoiding frightening behaviors. You're building trust between caregiver and parent. You're equipping parent and caregivers with the skills needed to support healthy development. It is one of the highest rated interventions in the country on both SAMHSA and California Clearinghouse. So when we saw the efficacy of this program nationally as a philanthropy, we wanted to test the outcomes in Kansas. So in partnership with 5 other philanthropies, the Kansas Health Foundation, the Wyandotte Health Foundation, the Hutchinson Community Foundation, the United Methodist Health Ministry Fund, partnered together to bring ABC to Kansas. At the same time, we saw the success in other states that showed the use of ABC in improving student success and school readiness and reducing caseloads in child welfare system. New York City saved $90 million with the implementation of ABC from their child welfare system, and then also long-term health impacts. So in 2017, we launched a 5-site pilot serving Northwest Kansas, Southwest Kansas, Hutchinson, Sedgwick County, and Johnson and Wyandotte counties. We wanted to see how this intervention could help Kansas parents and children build more secure relationships and to reduce the toxic stress these children were dealing with. As Dr. Hubbard laid out, toxic stress is inextricably linked to the ability of children to learn, the ability of them to process things healthily, and for them to develop. We partnered with a variety of different partners and trained home visitors on this intervention. The benefits of this intervention, as I said, is relatively brief, 10 weeks. The providers do not need to be licensed social workers, so we can take providers, train them, and they're folks with lived experience, so help build positive experiences with the caregivers and children from that lens, which is helpful, and train them. So we also launched a very extensive evaluation, which we just wrapped up last fall, which I wanted to share the results because I think as policymakers who are considering how to make evidence-based intervention investments that can show dividends and a return on investment, this might be of interest to you. So after completing the ABC program, caregivers' concerns regarding social emotional development and functioning decreased. Children's cortisol levels as an indicator of stress, which Dr. Hubbard really touched on, became more normalized, especially for children with the highest cortisol levels. Parent coaches rated children's overall well-being as more positive. Children's knowledge and beliefs in their caregiver capabilities increased. Interactions with children in caregiver intrusiveness went down, while sensory and delight went up, and caregiver capabilities improved. So these are significant outcomes that are connected to the items that I had mentioned, the ability to prepare children for schools and for them to have success. It helps them regulate emotions so that they are able to learn. It's called executive function. The cortisol level is a major finding. We actually did a very intensive evaluation where pre-intervention children's cortisol levels were measured through saliva tests, and then post-intervention they were measured by saliva tests. And the cortisol levels with the most at risk, most vulnerable kids decreased, and this is consistent with findings nationally. For children with more normalized cortisol levels at the beginning, we didn't see that drastic reduction, but that was to be expected. And we also saw, parent coaches of the ABC program making connections to other important early childhood programs, making sure wraparound services occurred, making sure that there was connections within the community mental health space and system, the juvenile justice system, the education system, and the health system. So we saw better coordination across the system and the system working better. This is just one intervention. There's a whole host of interventions that could be taking place, but given the high-risk population that were the beneficiaries or participants in this program and the results, we wanted to be sure to share that with this committee. And that's all I have. I'm happy to stand for questions after both presentations.
Great, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Tara Wallace with the Executive Director of Lighthouse. Hi, Tara, welcome to committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. I won't have much more to add, as Dr. Hubbard and Mr. Jordan have shared with you. ACEs is pretty serious. As a clinician in private practice, this is what I do. Dr. Hubbard, I'm glad to say, shared a really good presentation on how ACEs affects individuals, and that made it this much easier for me. What is not included in my written testimony is that I am an educator. I provide education to undergraduate social work students. It's my responsibility as an individual who has experienced ACEs and who works with individuals who experience ACEs, and someone who is at high risk to experience a lot of the things that Dr. Hubbard shared, to let those students know the impact that they could have when working with individuals, especially individuals in the child welfare system. So my job, my responsibility, as I said before, is to make sure that those individuals know the seriousness of what they do. I'm also a student. I'm a doctoral student at Liberty University studying community care and counseling with an emphasis in traumatology, because of the importance of ACEs and how everything that's happening today is impacting individuals, especially those connected to ACEs and experiencing ACEs. We're all experiencing ACEs, to be truthful. Everybody in the world is experiencing ACEs right now because of COVID. Something that I wanted to bring out is that the ACEs study in and of itself is a really good example of how the impact of trauma impacts people in the future. The study was a weight loss study, and ACEs coming out of that was accidental. Over time, those individuals lost weight, but then they began to gain weight. And to figure out how those individuals started gaining weight and why, they started asking questions. And what they learned is those individuals started gaining weight because the weight was a protective mechanism for them because of all of the trauma that they experienced as a child. A lot of them were molested. A lot of them were abused mentally, emotionally, and physically. And the weight, losing it, took away the protection that they had. So it was an accidental study that gave so much to the mental health field. And that's why it's important for people to understand what ACEs means and how much it opened for psychology and social work and sociology, because it explains so much about why people behave the way that they do. In the testimony that I submitted about Sam, that was one of the things that Dr. Hubbard brought out. You have to ask questions. You have to understand why people behave the way that they do. It doesn't have to make sense to you, but you have to understand. When you work with individuals, you don't have to understand and accept what they do. Understanding does not represent acceptance. It just creates a pathway to relationship. And that's how we create change. And that's a big part of what needs to happen in order for families to move forward. to healthy functioning. And that's what I do. That is one of the reasons that I decided to go for my doctorate, simply because I have a responsibility to educate myself. I have a responsibility to educate the individuals that I work with to help them understand so that they can advocate for themselves. And that's what I do. I also have a nonprofit simply because it became a challenge in working with the insurance carriers to help them understand that I can't help individuals understand themselves in 8 to 12 sessions. It doesn't work that way. You don't fix a broken person in a box. In this time frame, it doesn't work that way. ACEs doesn't happen like that. You create more problems when you try to fix individuals based on a schedule that has to do with a time frame because someone feels that that's the way that it happens. Life doesn't happen that way. How many of us thought that COVID was going to be gone in August of 2019? A lot of people did. And here we are wearing masks still. I know that I lost an entire year. If you ask me a question about what happened last year, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get it wrong unless I look at my calendar, simply because that's how ACEs works. And that's what people need to understand, and that's why it's important for all of us to have a clearer understanding of take a breath, ask questions, and understand. And that's how this process works for a lot of the families that I work with. And that's why it's important for everybody to have a better understanding and a clearer grasp of what ACEs is and what it represents, and so the intervention becomes more effective. And if it takes longer, it just takes longer, because that's how life happens for people that are dealing with trauma. I believe that's all I have, and I stand for questions as well.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your testimony and what you do. Committee, do we have questions for any of the three conferees? Representative Johnson and Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, those are three of the best presentations I've ever seen in this committee. Those were excellent. I enjoyed those. Do have a question involving, I guess, the religious background issue. I know in government, restrictions from public, I'm sorry, yes, I'm going to hit you up. The fact that a religious organization and their background, my personal experience has been that those families tend to nurture and provide care and assistance for those that have experienced a lot of these early childhood traumas. Do you feel that at times government is too preoccupied with restricting religious groups from serving to share those benefits? Am I making sense at all?
I thank you, Representative Johnson. I don't know that I'll try my best to get to the thrust of your question. I think there's an important role that government can play in providing sustainable funding to important interventions to combat the impacts of ACEs, or to make sure that we're providing the best use of tax dollars for the greatest investment. And that's why we as a faith-based organization invest in proven early childhood interventions. This one happens to be investing in building strong relationships and attachment between a caregiver or parent and their child, and the science behind that validates that approach. We are a nonprofit organization. We don't take any government funding. I think that there's an appropriate role for the grantees that we fund in this case aren't all churches, aren't faith-based organizations. We're talking about Russell Child Development, Live Well Northwest Kansas, Horizons Mental Health Center, Rainbows, and Project Eagle. So I think it's been proven in a variety of settings. But at the same time, we do support over 80 churches in Kansas to train them in interventions to help. So I think there's an important role for faith-based organizations to play, and for government and the private sector to play.
So I guess that second part of that is, there is a place for us to work together.
Absolutely.
To make the faith-based as part of the system, not to overlook their tremendous impact in positive ways. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here. Being a school person, we have a school psychiatrist, maybe for the whole district. And I think kids today need much more than they did when I was a kid. We didn't have a psychiatrist, and yet we only have one. And maybe he's only there, or she's only there one day a week. There's no way that these kids can get the help that they need. And I know we need more teachers, but I think mental health, we're falling way behind, trauma-wise or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Representative Smith, for that question. I think in that as a health fund, I think that's why we see investing, recognizing that 80% of brain development happens before the age of 4, before kids get to school, and the important role that having a strong, secure, nurturing relationship with a caregiver, parent or otherwise. I mean, when you're in school, it could be a coach, to making sure that kids have those strong, secure, nurturing relationships that helps them mitigate the impacts of trauma and adverse experiences. Kids are going to experience stress, as Dr. Hubbard said, but it's the relationships that they have that can happen. And I think there's investments that can be made before kids get to school to hopefully make sure that they're ready to learn and healthier. That's why these investments, they have for every dollar invested in early childhood is a $13 return during the life of that child. So there's a lot of potential there. There's also a lot of potential to look at how to improve access to school-based mental health services and how to leverage Medicaid to do that.
This is just an opinion, but when I grew up, teachers were more strict. The ministers were more strict. The coaches were more strict. The military was more strict. And now we're in a looser society and we have more problems than we did. And I grew up in a house that I think had plenty of trauma because my dad was 5-year veteran of World War II, wounded at the Battle of the Bulge, and we watched our step. So we had plenty of trauma in our house, but it turned out all right. So I just think maybe we're a little too loose. Do you disagree?
Well, all I can say is pointing to the science that, every child's gonna, and Dr. Hubbard may have some different take. Every child and every person is gonna deal with stress. It's how they deal with them, how that stress impacts them. And we know that having a safe, nurturing relationship is the #1 factor in helping them buffer that stress. So even if I think everyone probably has had different upbringings, but different levels of stress in their house. But if there's just one adult to have a safe, strong, nurturing relationship with, that can make all the difference in the world. And I think sometimes that is tough, and it's not the fault of the parent. They may not know how to provide those skills, or they may not have the resources. So I think the question is, how can we equip caregivers with those resources? Because we know that's what the science supports. If a kid can regulate their behaviors, they're more likely to be able to learn in school and not be a problem. You're not going to see that behavior manifest itself. So I think that's the role of, and I don't think we're too far apart on this, Representative, but that's the role of having someone that you can trust. And everyone's definition of nurturing is different, but being able to be attached to a parent that you can trust or a caregiver, that's going to make the difference in their readiness to be in school, their ability to regulate emotions, and their ability to deal with that stress that occurs, whether or not it's at home or at school or on the playground or on the football field.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks.
I've got a question for Dr. Hubbard. So I thought that the picture of the brain was real impactful. Have you seen pictures, this may sound really dumb, but have you seen pictures, is there a way to catch up? Like, have you seen pictures after a child has been nurtured and hopefully show some improvement?
You know, I have not personally seen those pictures, but my guess is that they probably do exist because we do know it's treatable. And that's something that I've learned along this journey with trauma-informed care and what happens. It is treatable, and I think that's the disconnect. And a lot of times we have focused on punishment or something, or a temporary Band-Aid, not getting the child and the parent in the context of their family unit, community, getting the care that they need together. And so I think it's really, we have to dig deeper to get that. And so I can, just like Mr. Jordan said, we have seen positive improvements. And I think with the cortisol and the saliva studies, I mean, that makes very much sense because that's part of that fight, flight, or freeze. So while I have not seen specific pictures, I think they probably do exist. And we know at least functionally that there is an improvement. I always tell parents when we're talking about a baby's brain MRI that it's a picture, it shows a structure, it doesn't show us function. But that's why those first few years are so incredibly important, because they can, even if there is injury, they can still make new connections.
So in foster care, when we are removing children from homes and then placing them in a place where they are physically safe and getting meals and going to school, what are we missing? What do they need for the treatment?
So I think that's a great question. I will tell you from looking at neonatal abstinence syndrome for babies that have been exposed to opioids in utero during pregnancy, that many of those babies are taken into foster care, whether it was for opioids or other drug use. And so I think where we've been missing the mark, and I will say in the healthcare community too, we've learned a lot through neonatal abstinence syndrome, but the majority, about half of kids, especially infants that are removed from the home, it's for parental substance use, but also 50% usually end up back with that family unit. But in between, there's no healing, no growth, no getting them the services they need. And what has happened is that just the way that our system has been traditionally, in our good intentions to keep those children safe, is that we've added trauma by taking them out of the home. So that's why it's so important that services, that we kind of rethink and think outside the box. How can we get the parent what they need? So mental health treatment, address their trauma, get them the support parenting classes, and then the child too, and help them heal together. So then you can remove that more traumatic part of being separated and then trying to get back together and work on that relationship. That can be really, really difficult. And I think the mental health care system in general, again, I'm trying to normalize that the brain is an organ like anything else. We have no trouble taking blood pressure medicine or going to cardiac rehab. But when it comes to the brain, there's a stigma that's related to it, and yet our brain is our most powerful organ. And so just like my mom had quadruple bypass, so that's why I'm using the cardiac example, but just blood pressure medicine isn't going to fix anything. She needs to do cardiac rehab, healthy diet, all of that. Same thing with mental health care. It's very easy to get a drug, a prescription with a $15 copay for whatever, but therapy is often not paid for. But therapy is going to get to the root of the problem, not just the Band-Aid. And so I think that's been a big mark just, nationally that we've really missed. And I'm hoping that we can start thinking about this because it's affecting more of our children. And there are so many new stresses that even I didn't have growing up with social media and information and technology and false information. That is so dangerous. So there's a lot of different challenges. So I think as you, as a committee, talk about how to enact policies to help children, one, the return on investment is just incredible. And there can be healing, but we have to stop doing the temporary Band-Aid effects. We really need to dig deeper.
Well, thank you for that answer. That's excellent. I think that, we've got the Families First implemented, and that's addressing a lot of the things that you said as far as prevention. They reported the other day that in the last year, 90% of the families that they had dealt with, that they had been able to prevent, or I shouldn't say prevent, but they had not entered foster care. So, but I have been looking into how frequently those foster kids are receiving therapy and mental health services, and it's not what we had hoped to attain for them. Question, Representative Penn. You don't have a question. Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This could be a question for Dr. Hubbard or Ms. Wallace. I wanted to clarify based on your last comment. So to confirm, is therapy not covered by Medicaid therapy services?
I do not know the specifics of that, but I know many healthcare, commercial insurance often doesn't. So, but I could find out for you on that.
I'm kind of curious to know the answer to that. And then I know, Ms. Wallace, you talked a little bit about how there are sometimes restrictions on the amount of times that you can work with a client. And I was wondering where those restrictions come from and if there's anything we can do to maybe help with that. Thank you.
The managed care organizations. It is covered. In Kansas, you can provide therapy maximum 45 minutes, one time a week. You can provide family therapy for 30 minutes a week. To answer Representative Smith's question previously, I wholeheartedly agree, which is why I started a nonprofit organization, because I got fed up with jumping through the obstacles of the insurance. And so my nonprofit provides it for free, because it's just not worth it for me to wait for the insurance to kick in, because families can't wait for that. I agree that you have a support system surrounding a family that is in need, and to prevent them from going into foster care, you get the family, you get the neighbors, you get the church, you get the school, you get whoever is their village. And you ask them, what do you need? What do you need to keep this situation from exploding? Okay, let's all sit down and figure out what you guys need to keep you together. How can I support you? And that's what we do. That's what my foundation does. And it works. And I don't have to have so many sessions to keep them together. And that works until it no longer works. But if I were to go through the insurance, I could only do that one time a week. But if it's more than just the client, I can only do it for 45 minutes. If I do it for 60 minutes, the insurance is going to deny that, because you rarely can bill 60 minutes, and you can't bill 60 minutes with everybody there. It just has to be the client, because they don't pay for a 60-minute session. So I wholeheartedly agree that having a structure, is what you were speaking to, helps the family to stay together and keeps them stronger. I wholeheartedly agree with that. But yes, it does pay for the sessions. The issue is, if they're in the foster care system, finding them, and then maintaining contact. I have a situation now where the child is in foster care, but they're not in the same city as the parent. And so if there's nobody to bring the child to the parent, we miss a session. And that's a situation that we can't address, because the child is in Wichita, family's in Topeka.
Thank you for that insight. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
If you don't mind, something else I was thinking about, Representative Vaughn. One of the other issues with Medicaid is that we don't have Medicaid parity with Medicare. So overall, even for normal newborn care, reimbursement is very poor. So the reason that's important is that then there are not as many options available. Sometimes I have a really hard time finding a pediatrician that can take Medicaid patients. And it's not because pediatricians don't want to take Medicaid patients. It's that the reimbursement is so poor that they can't do that, or the contracts, it just gets so crazy. And so I think that is also a barrier, and we need more trained people that can do mental health. And so we have to support them with programs, to get people in these areas. And then also not just a quick fix where it's a telehealth, somebody in another state and they have, a year of training and they just prescribe meds, because that's happening too. And that is definitely not the fix. So I think supporting therapy, I think your return on investment is actually going to be much greater, but for whatever reason, insurance does not support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I've looked at that for years, trying to see what we could do to improve the provider reimbursement. Indiana, I don't know how they did it, but they did it right. They pay the same, Medicare and Medicaid. And we are so far from that I just don't, we can't even get an increase, let alone parity. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Any of you, going back to education, I really think every kid just needs to belong to a group. And what you hope is he belongs to a positive group that will give him that support. It doesn't have to be football, basketball, it doesn't have to be any of that. Just a positive group that he feels comfortable in. And because there's a lot of negative groups that he'll fall into and get in trouble. So I think that is so crucial, just to push these kids towards a positive group. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to David Jordan, I hope, not necessarily a question, just comment, but I hope one day you can get in front of the K-12 committee, because I think what you bring to the table would be valuable in that committee as far as investment and prevention. And then the comment that was made about, 2 generations being the study. I appreciate that, and it's given me something to think about as I sit here as a parent of 3. What am I doing wrong? Because we don't have enough time in this committee. But you've all discussed ACEs, and if anybody would like to comment on the effects of persistent poverty and what effects that has on kids. We've talked about, food insecurity in this committee, and we know housing insecurity is a real thing. So I'd just be open for a little more conversation on that if anybody has a comment they'd like to make.
One of my slides mentioned that if you're in poverty, housing insecurity, all of those things, ACEs are likely to be higher. And so those are so foundational. And I know there's legislation right now regarding SNAP for kids. But, in one of the examples, I said, imagine if a kid's being bullied at school, how that fight, flight, or freeze is always on. They're afraid they're going to get picked on. Think about if you are hungry. And we have children in Kansas that are hungry. And it's hard to learn when you're hungry. I get hangry plenty. And so, it's hard to focus and keep your attention. And these are children, and their brains are growing exponentially. So I think you're right. This is what we're learning about social determinants of health, that the health care that I was trained to provide 14 years of school is only about 10%, affects only a patient's health, 10% of their health. Much of the rest of it are all these things that you mentioned, and those are the social determinants of health. So I think that's part of thinking about this in a different way and not putting Band-Aids, but let's get to the root of the problem and addressing those things, because the return will be much greater. And then I just want to add the point that when we were talking about parity, this goes along with it. I think in our society, it's interesting that children are considered not as important. And I don't know if that's because they don't vote. Many of us have children, but the way a society takes care of their children says a lot. And so I think if we can turn the focus on what can we do for these kids, then that may help with, healthcare costs down the road, legal problems, mental health and violence, all of those things. So while it's not a quick fix, I'm really encouraged to just, that you're having this discussion and you're asking these questions, because that's really where we're going to move the needle. It's not the Band-Aids. We've got to get to the root of the problem, and it's going to take all of us working together. And your point about connection as part of a group is so incredibly important. I know I've felt that even just with the pandemic and not being able to have those connections and relationships, how hard that is. And so I think that's a very good point. And so we want to set kids up for success, and that is so important.
Thank you for that. And when people ask me what I've learned as a legislator, a lot of the times I'll comment that every cliche is based upon reality. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And with your comment to, investing in the children, paying attention to the children, which generation do we want to start with? This is the Children and Seniors Committee. Our senior population needs help. Our children need help. So it's where can we put the best resources that we have as a state in the most applicable manner? And then, David, you were standing up. Did you have something to add to that?
I was just build off of Dr. Hubbard's piece. I do think that healthcare is more than what happens in a doctor's office, and it also, the hoops that were described earlier in terms of making it tougher for providers to provide that community-based care. I think we also need to be cognizant, and I think that's what Dr. Hubbard was getting at, that we shouldn't be requiring parents and children to go through multiple hoops to get access to food assistance, or to get access to cash assistance, or to get access to home visiting services. And I think there's, as from a policy perspective, there's the rate discussion, right? How can we make it more advantageous for providers to have that incentive to provide those services? Then there's both from a provider and patient or child standpoint, how do we reduce the administrative barriers that may be on kids or families to accessing food assistance? And, I think one thing that might be worth a look is at the HOPE Act. What are we forcing kids and parents to go to get some help to get food? What are we forcing them to go through to get other assistance? And I think that's where there's a big role for policymakers to play. And we've seen success in reducing ACEs when you're able to get at some of those social determinants of health, the things that happen outside of a doctor's office. And I think that you all can play a valuable role in that. I know a few years ago, with the legislature on the home visiting front, again, helping equip parents to be better parents, strengthen those bonds. For the HOPE Act, there was a budget amendment, and I think it actually passed, and it may need sort of reauthorization, was to count the home visiting interactions as the work requirement. So I think that's another way you can look at reinforcing positive behavior by reducing administrative barriers. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
David, before you walk off, I've spoken before in this committee about our trip to North Carolina. Representative Waymaster and I talk about that a lot in appropriations. Can you talk just a little bit about, how that all, I just don't remember that well about how was it that, did they just have a champion in the governor? How did they get where they were? And they didn't. They were healthy financially. They didn't break break the bank doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Representative Kincannon, and I'd be happy to go back and look at some notes. So several years ago, pre-COVID, we had the benefit of being able to take a group of folks from this administration and this legislature to North Carolina to learn more about their early childhood system and their health system, which really took a more holistic approach to the social determinants of health. And one of the reasons why that was possible was because there was bipartisan support, and also there was partnership between the commercial healthcare carrier in the state, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the MCOs as the state was going through managed care reprocurement, much like we'll be dealing with in the next couple of years. And they really prioritized both how to adequately fund early childhood and put it in that health space, but came up with using Medicaid to pay for things that were more than just things within a doctor's office. So you could work with a community group, and that community group would contract with Medicaid, and then they would get a fixed payment to help connect a family to food, or help connect a family to a housing voucher, or help connect a family to another social need. And it didn't break the bank because you had a really good integrated referral system where you can make an early referral, you'd give them the support they needed, and it really was a transition. It was much like some programs like food assistance, it was a work support. It was a pathway to them, getting to work and becoming more, having a work support program. So I think there was a lot of good lessons learned from North Carolina, but there was a lot of good alignment between, private and public insurance payers, and between the politics, and the legislature and the administration worked well together. But it was taking a look at social needs and addressing them and finding a way to pay for services and support families that needed it. And happy to go into more detail in the future.
That was great, just right off the cuff. I appreciate you giving that synopsis. Representative Penn, did you have a question? No.
No. My apologies, Madam Chair. What I was saying too was I agree with you. That was all. And going on Representative Vaughn's line of questioning to the conferees, just trying to understand if I could have a request. If we get information, what does that analysis look like if we had cost savings to reach that parity that you were talking about in the off years? If we didn't have that type of therapy going forward, what do we lose? How much does that cost? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve? I'm all about making sure that we have accountability, transparency, and make sure that we don't have waste, fraud, and abuse in the system, and being stewards of the tax dollars. But it comes into question that if we're going to look at the holistic approach of what we're doing for our communities, how are we spending our money the right way? And if we need to make some changes, let's do that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all. Thanks for the presentations today. Those were excellent, and appreciate the discussion. And we will be back tomorrow, where we will have Melissa Rooker here talking about the Children's Cabinet. See you tomorrow. We're adjourned.